Welcome to the Virtual Coffee Lab. Today, I'm going to share with you 5 ways that I use air during the roasting process while I roast coffee. So stick around. All right, thanks for joining me today. So I'm going to share with you the 5 ways that I use air to roast coffee. But I recognize that you may have ways that you use air to roast coffee that are different than me. So I would encourage you, once you listen to the 5 ways that I use air, to let me know how you use air during your roasting process. Last week we had a guest on. His name is Rob Hoos, and he shared a lot of different answers to questions that you had and I had about coffee roasting, and one of them pertained to air, and it just seemed that spurred on more questions that you guys asked. You wanted to know things like, how does air impact the roasting process? How does air influence the drying phase, or how much air should be added? And so I'm just going to share with you how I do it, and again, I'd love to hear your comments as well. Before I get to the first of the 5, I did want to let you guys know that this is a drum roaster and you may be roasting on a completely different device. So you may be on a popcorn popper or using a frying pan or some fluid bed roaster. And I think the most important thing that we can do that will help us both is to understand how beans are actually roasted. So that may sound like a silly point, but I just want to kind of put this out there so we understand when we start to go through this process of air. Beans are roasted in 2 ways. They're roasted with conductive type heat. And that is where the beans are touching each other or they're touching the wall of the drum. And this hot surface is transferring heat from the bean to another bean or from the wall of the drum to a bean. And so that's called conductive heat. Rob Hoos, last week, he mentioned that 70% of drum roasting uses convection style heat. And convection is the air movement around the bean that helps penetrate and roast that bean. 70%, that's pretty significant. So air is an important factor while we roast coffee. And that's why I'm going to share with you the 5 ways that I use air to roast my coffee. So the first is even before I roast. It is the warm up. I will actually turn my air on to a medium setting, and I'll turn my burners on to allow my machine to warm up. I'll have my burners set at about 25%, and I'll let the machine warm up for 30 minutes, sometimes longer, to get the machine completely warmed up. The air is moving the heat around. It's not just the drum that's getting heated by the flame, but it's the hot air that's being blown around inside of the drum and throughout the whole system that's adding to that warm-up process. So that's the first way that I use air while I roast. The second is during this dry phase. I will use a low setting on my airflow during the dry process. So from the time I charge the beans until dry end, I have a low setting because I do want to allow this conductive heat transfer to take place. But the other reason is because if I turn my air up too high too soon, I'm going to blow all that energy out of the roaster. I won't have enough energy to move myself up to dry end in the time period that I want to. So I'm reserving the use of my air until I get to the dry end. And so the middle phase is important to me. The ending phase is important to me, but none of that's going to happen and happen properly if I can't have the temperatures that I need to have to get me up to dry end. If I turn that fan up and I blow out all of my energy and it's going to take me 8 or 9 minutes to get through a dry phase when I would normally do it in less than 5, and my roaster is struggling to try to keep up because I'm blowing all of my hot air or all of my heat out of the roaster through the exhaust, I don't want to do that. And so that's why I use a low setting on this roaster. You may have a different environment where you've got plenty of energy to spare and it's not a big deal for you. One thing I will warn you about is moving that roast too fast during the dry process, the dry phase, and that could cause roasting defects like tipping and scorching and what have you. Most of the scorching is going to happen from the drum wall, but the tipping just is too much heat. The bean can't handle that much heat. All right, before we get to our next point, I just want to thank you for watching this video. If you like what you're hearing, hit the like button. That will help more new home coffee roasters find this channel and hopefully answer some questions that they may have. Also, they may be able to participate and share comments as well. Also, if you are newer to this channel and you haven't subscribed, do that for me. That would be awesome. That really helps me. And most importantly, if you want to be notified the next time new videos come out, just hit that bell icon. So let's get to the next point and how we use air and how I use air to roast coffee. All right, the third way that I use air to roast coffee is for convection purposes. I want to transition from the conduction type heating that I'm using in the drying phase to introduce more air into the roasting process just before dry end to allow convection style heating. And that means air is going to be moving around the beans and the roast is really going to start progressing. So at the same time that I'm doing that, just before I call dry end, I've added my air, I got it at a medium setting, I'm backing off my gas. I'm doing that because I don't want my roast to be moving so quickly through this middle phase that we're just approaching that I'm going to blow right through first crack and be out of control. So I want to be cautious, add my air in, and then back off my gas and allow my rate of rise to start to descend. So I still have a lot of convection related roasting going on. The temperature of the beans or the drum temperature is continuing to rise, but it's rising at a controlled rate and at a slower rate. So my rate of rise will start to go down and I'm moving my way towards first crack. So all of this process during this middle phase and the ending phase, I'm using convection heat. And as a matter of fact, and I may have mentioned this earlier in the video, Rob Hoos mentioned last week that 70% of drum roasting is done with convection style heating, and that's where this phase is right here. It starts at the dry end and it goes all the way through to the end of the roast. Some people have their settings, again, as Rob had mentioned, set at one fixed rate all the way through, and that's great if you want to do that. But for me and my style, I'm using this method where I'm bumping this up, starting my convection just before dry end. Okay, the fourth way that I am using air to roast is for an emergency brake. So I had mentioned before that when you're going from dry end into this middle phase, I'm backing my gas off, I'm turning my air up. But sometimes the roast is still going too quickly, or maybe I didn't back my gas off early enough and I'm moving too quickly through this middle phase and I'm going to reach first crack way earlier than I want to. As a matter of fact, that's one of the most common roasting mistakes, is to having your roast get out of control. It progresses so quick during this middle phase and towards first crack. I've even had people tell me that they reached first crack and then they dropped the beans even while the beans were cracking and there was oils on the beans. Well, that doesn't happen until second crack. They were moving so quickly through this roasting process that they actually blew through first and second crack and they didn't even know it because they were moving too quickly. So I'm watching my rate of rise, I'm watching my times, I'm making sure that the pace of my roast is under control, but there have been times when I've needed to slow my roast down, and that's when I use the emergency brake. That's when I'll bump my air for just a few seconds. You'll have to pay attention really carefully on how much air to introduce, because you'll basically be jetting hot air out of the system so that the roast will slow down just a little bit. If you do that too much, you risk crashing and not being able to regain that momentum you had in your roast, losing too much heat by doing the emergency brake move. So I would be very cautious if you do that. Out of the last 10 roasts, I think I've had to do it once just to try to keep myself from reaching first crack sooner than I wanted to. It's not something that I make a practice of, but there are chances where you can recover by using this method as an emergency brake to slow down your roast. The fifth and final way that I use air when I'm roasting my coffee is to have air move smoke out of the drum once I approach first crack. When we hit first crack, or even a little bit before, the beans start to smoke. And we want to have that smoke pushed out of the drum so that it's not tainting or saturating the beans with that flavor, unless that's what you want. If that's what your goal is, to have a smoky, darker taste, then by all means go ahead. You don't need to worry about moving the smoke out of your system as quickly. For me, it's important for me. I'm looking for a cleaner cup. I'm looking for more of the origin flavors and tastes rather than the smoky, darker notes of the coffee. And so I am bumping my air up from that medium setting that I use in my middle phase to a medium high setting during the last development stage between first crack and when I drop the beans. One important thing to note is that when you bump that air to the medium high setting, you're actually going to be slowing the roast down a little bit more. So pay attention to your temperatures, pay attention to your times. You may need to adjust your heat a little bit. Some people have enough energy where they can coast through this without any gas at all. But just be cautious, because when you add more air, you're forcing more of that heat out the exhaust and you could lose momentum. So be very cautious. But it's also a nice way just before you drop to bring that rate of rise down, right down to a point where it's like 5 or 6 for the rate of rise, and you're dropping the beans right then. It's a beautiful thing to have that all kind of work together. So watch your times, watch your rate of rise, and be very careful how you introduce air into this last phase when you're trying to move smoke out of your roaster. All right, those are the 5 ways that I use air to roast coffee. I would love to hear your comments and the ways that you are roasting coffee. Share those in your comments, and then we will see you next week here at the Virtual Coffee Lab.